So from this point on, the topics you're going to be covering are some of the most important stuff in Duel, and that is stuff like buffs, XP, wave pressure, early fighting, awareness, rotations, just lots of stuff. So let's start off at the beginning. We talked about the importance of early game builds. This is because it has a huge impact on the fight for red, which can affect the entire game based on the snowball. So to begin with, don't be late. Typically, the meta is everyone just meets in the lane and you fight or have a little poke war for the red buff. Sometimes people with good buff clear or that are just not that confident in the early game fight can just start at their blue. But doing this can be risky for a couple of reasons. You can be late to wave, not get red, or they could even invade you if they're just checking where you are. And if they invade, they have a potential to get all 3 buffs early game, which can be really, really bad. And if you start blue, you're almost always basically just giving them a 2 buff lead and lane pressure over you. So, after you both meet in the lane, the fight for red buff begins. Pay attention to what points they have into what. If they have no jumps, specific abilities that you can take advantage of, things like that are very important. There's one of the first steps to general awareness in Duel. Bigger uses for awareness will come more into play when we hit the baiting section of the guide. But I will be including map awareness in this portion. Winning the early game can be very important for snowballing. The ability to be safely aggressive, gain pressure on the waves, and even safely invade buffs can all be gained just off the first few waves alone. Early game starts can vary based on the god you're playing. How much sustain you have in your kit, how good your clear is, things like this affect your start very heavily. It can also depend on your build. If you have more sustain, protections, or early DPS than the enemy, just always factor in the amount of sustain the enemy has, especially their potions. A good example of knowing when to pressure the enemy is when they build tier 2 Bancrofts, for example. If you can recognize how much sustain the enemy has, you can choose to focus them way more than the wave if you're given the opportunity, because you can most likely out-sustain them if you're smart about pressuring them out of the few potions that they have. Using Bracer early on can be very important. Even if you don't feel you need to survive, like using it right after you get bursted by their combo early on just gives you way more HP at times, and it just can help you sustain longer in the early game fight. It also benefits to use it this early because Bracer is not on a very long cooldown, so the earlier you use it, the faster it will come up for the next fight, and you can catch a person off guard with that if you use it before them. Honestly, a big tip coming from me is just don't be afraid to use relics if you need to. I have a really bad habit of risking really close engagements by just not using my relics often enough, when just putting them on cooldown and playing accordingly would do so much more for me. If you manage to outclear or outpressure the enemy but don't have time to completely get red, you can get red minis and reset them from a distance to get some free XP. Getting level 5 first can also help a lot with pressure. You could also clear them instantly with an ability, but keep in mind you may lose lane pressure when you return to the wave without a certain ability that you might need. You could also do this with blue buff minis when you go back around, but it's risky because you can lose the wave pressure or buff pressure depending on how long your rotation takes. So in regards to poking out the enemy sometimes though, be careful because this example can also be applied back to you. If the enemy has used his clear and hasn't really touched the wave, for example, recognize that you can probably finish red before they finish clearing the wave, or can rotate to the red buff in time. In some cases though, if you're confident enough in your secure because you have a high bursting ability, and you're confident in your ability to secure, you can just go for the buff. Gods that are good with this sort of thing are more higher bursty characters, like I said, like maybe Ymir, Bakasura, Thanatos, gods like that. But always be careful when you are trying to secure the red buff though, because if you don't fully commit, you will end up taking a lot of poke, because it does a lot of damage early game and it can end up putting you in a really bad position. A solution to overwhelming wave pressure, or just pressure on the red buff, is to move up carefully after clearing the melees, and hide around the corner near the red and the archers. This keeps pressure on the red as you're near it, as well as keeps you in range of the archers, so you get the XP without actually taking any damage from them. Another big part of the early game fight is using wave aggression to your benefit. You shouldn't be surprised by archer damage, you should use it as a mechanic. For example, if you accidentally hit an enemy god while clearing a wave, just make sure you back up enough so the range creeps can't actually hit you. Paying very close attention to the creeps will drastically help your early game. Get used to their distance and how much damage your creeps do. Making your opponent accidentally hit you, for example, or hitting them well out of range can completely change the early game sustain battle to your favor. Aggroing the enemy out of range of their archers by a tiny bit can actually help your wave pressure, because being out of creep range makes them not able to hit you while being aggro to you and not hitting your wave for a little bit. If you manage to kill them and get red, usually at this point it's still a little too risky to go for their blue buff, as you probably can't clear it before they get there. And even if you do, you'll most likely be low and out of position. If you still have a comfortable amount of potions or are confident in your god or ability to pressure though, you could probably go for their blue at this point. Even though they most likely do have to go to the wave to get the XP, some might choose to contest their blue depending on the situation. I do this a lot in Thanatos more than any other god. If you want an example on how to properly rotate with pressure, I suggest watching one of my Thanatos videos. If you manage to get red and force them to back, you should most likely back. Usually they will make it back to the wave just after you finish it. Backing will keep you on pace with the waves, and it secures your blue buff in case they try to rotate or invade it or anything. Quick tip, if you're in a comfortable enough position, you can back right beside the wave, which can be really useful and sometimes give you that little bit of XP you need, just like here. The risk of buff stealing can happen at any point in the game. Don't just think of it as an early game thing. Always keep in mind when the enemy is going to be at a base or where they are when you're invading a buff. If you do get red, be sure to capitalize on the lead. Make sure you're always rotating the wave on time, getting buffs off cooldown, pressuring their buffs, getting minis, everything you can possibly do to maintain your lead. Remember to keep up the pressure, but be careful when you're snowballing. Don't overcommit and go for crazy plays based on thirst. You need to realize that one death, even when stupidly far ahead, can screw over your entire lead. Especially with the new changes that prevent snowballing that carried over to Duel from Conquest. Off one death, they can get free waves, buffs, and objectives, which can sometimes completely bring them back in the game. This is important, especially if you're playing a lower tier god than the enemy. A big mindset for keeping up the snowball is to just bully based on the pressure that you have, but not take risks that you'd normally take if you were behind trying to catch back up. You can get away with taking risks when you're behind, but when you're ahead, you lose so much more. Remember to always be careful about what you do after a kill. If a tower is going to die to minions, don't waste time going and hitting it. Prioritize rotating to the next buff, objectives, or minis or something. You should never waste any time when collecting XP. You want to be as efficient as possible. Keep in mind the longer it takes for you to get a buff, for example, the less XP per minute you're going to be getting overall. But also don't put yourself at a position like here, for example. If you're not sure you can get away with doing what you want, which would be to get his blue buff here and then red, take the safer option. Just go and get red, you get the tower, and your own blue buff. This is an extremely big thing that most people don't pay attention to. Basically, just backing off to complete a specific item tier. Normally, if there's literally nothing to be fighting over, there's no waves to push, no buffs to contest, and you have enough gold for even a tier 1, if you're even in a remotely bad position, you might as well just back off and start up your next stage of an item. There's literally no downside to this, and it's something people skip over all the time when they're just itching to fight and are impatient. This is especially important for certain stages of items like tier 2 defense, second tier percentage pen, or even finishing an entire item. This can literally make or break certain fights. And once you realize you could have won with just a certain little stage of an item and you had no reason not to get it, it's very frustrating. The same thing can be applied for a second relic, or just backing when you need more health. Also, quick tip, if you are ahead in levels and you're going to back to get your second relic, you can also wait if you want to see what relic they're going to get, so you can counterpick it. So, that's the general information on the fight for red as well as snowballing, and here is a bunch of other useful XP related tips. Also, before we start, some of this information isn't exactly all XP related entirely, but it's still extremely useful information that I couldn't quite fit into a certain topic, so here we go. The biggest tip overall in Duel is to be patient. Yeah, we'll start out with a broad one. Patience is ridiculously important in Duel. At this point, with the information I've given you up to this point, you've probably even started to realize that majority of the information in Duel revolves around patience and, one way or another. So just keep your head up and try and be as patient as you can. If an enemy gets too close to a wall near blue buff, for example, you can actually see their shadows through the wall. Sounds actually travel very far on this map, and you can use this to your advantage with certain sounds. Thor ults, Loki invis, stance changing gods, just try to use sound as much as you can to your advantage. You can actually hear if a camp is up from a distance. It has a spawning sound and a default sound it makes every once in a while. I recommend turning off jump stamps as you can actually see them from a distance when you can't actually see the player. Same goes for Bull Demon. You can actually see when someone is attacking it from a distance depending on your angle in the alleyways. Always make sure you are in range of creeps when they die so you get the XP or the gold. There are certain spots around the map you can actually use to get XP efficiently. The side of the blue buff, if you can't jump over it or would miss too many creeps by rotating around. The spot near red, I showed during the red fight portion. You can also hang around the alleyway to gank the enemy while not losing any XP. Or just keeping pressure on them and making sure they don't get XP. Here's a list of how much XP pretty much everything is worth so that you can get an idea as to what's worth rotating to. Minis are 150 XP total. Waves are 330 total, 65 for melees, 45 for archers. Buffs are 221 XP total. Bull Demon is 200 XP and 100 gold. Towers are 100 XP, 150 gold. And Phoenix is 150 gold and no XP. Using certain ults can be useful for securing waves or buffs depending on a CDR and the situation you're in. Don't be afraid to use your ult efficiently rather than holding it for long periods of time. First Blood is worth dying for. Towers killing you do not reward the enemy unless they hit you before it kills you. If they're close enough, it will get an assist though. If you're worried the enemy is going to buy a relic to counter you, you can wait for them to buy theirs before you make your decision if you're ahead. When trying to pressure, you can also hold waves to zone campers out of some XP. It's usually not very effective as people hide around corners or can clear from a distance, but it's possible. Also, if you do it in a winning matchup or during every wave, you're kinda just an asshole. If you think about it realistically, how much holding a wave does for you, it's practically meaningless in most situations, as you could be rotating faster to buffs, or objectives, or finishing an item. In some situations it is useful, but only if you have the opportunity to do so. You can actually jump to see blue. It's more difficult with a restricted camera pitch, but it's possible depending on the size of your god.